going back to the drawing board to evaluate economic strategy policies towards China. And so therefore, to be talking about China's strategic statecraft in terms of its very large public sector, I think is a very good thing to be doing right now. It's a very good thing to be discussing right now. It's also very useful to be reminded of what drives the PRC's economic policies and where regional and global economies either cede open space to Chinese entities or call out China on economic practices and processes which violate or transgress broadly accepted norms. And the latter process, of course, already begun. We've seen that with the Huawei thing, we've seen that with the trade war and the sanctioning of Chinese enterprises, state-owned enterprises, both by the World Bank Group as well as by major economies across the world, right? And I think for a long time, we have been talking about the Chinese economy as a socialist market economy. And in one sense, we have accepted the contradictions that are inherent in the term of a socialist market economy. And it has blurred actually the ideological contours of the state. So that when we talk about, talk about Tang's white, black cat, the instrumentalist use of the market or the instrumentalist use of socialist market economy as a term to explain China's reforms, I think we tend to forget that ideology in China is not merely an instrumentalist tool. It's actually at the heart of how Chinese leaders and policymakers perceive the state and the objectives of the state. And it's also good to be reminded that ideology informs and frames policy in China. It's not just a discursive area. It also frames policy in China, and very clearly so. And even when Chinese policymakers use terms like opening up, white cat, black cat, or privatization, behind this is a very Marxist ideological perspective on what the objectives of these very instrumentalist terms would be. And essentially they have been, as Arvind also argues in his book largely, that they have been to shore up this public sector, the state sector of the economy in China, which again, as we all know, is about 60% of the economy of China actually. But more interestingly, I think, what has also happened is that the guidelines that have been issued, and we tend to forget this sometimes, that the guidelines that the CPC or the NPC issues periodically in China on the directions for the economy are generally tended to balance marketization and the strengthening of the socialist statecraft, as Arvind has noted, right? So in a sense, what we're looking at is this very finely balanced trick that the Chinese establishment has been doing ever since 1978, since the reform started. And the fact that they have created a whole discursive space for discussing a market economy and a socialist market economy tends to blur the fact that at the heart of it is a very strategic impulse in terms of the control of the public economy, of the public sector in China. Over the years, we've noticed that the Chinese have said we will reform the SOE sector, the state-owned enterprises sector, and this has been going on since 1990. So periodically, there has been a great deal of hype about what China is going to do on the SOEs. Ultimately, every time we notice that what is called for is not for the state sector to be diminished, but the state sector to be strengthened through a series of reforms. The consequence, of course, has been, and this is very interesting because the consequences are now coming home to root in one sense, is that its reform policies actually create fundamental distortions within this economy. And these are critical, and so that the reforms of these institutions, like the financial institutions or fiscal policies, become very critical to the strengthening of the economy. So for the last 20 years, China has been under pressure to actually reform its budgetary economy. It's also been under pressure to reform its financial institutions. And yet, all of those reforms have actually tended to towards strengthening the SOE sector rather than reforming the financial sector, so that we still see high levels of debt in local governments, we still see high levels of debts in SOEs, etc. And these are not really going to go away. This makes the Chinese economy internally extremely unbalanced and somewhat weak. For economic partners who are looking at the Chinese market, and we have often noticed these debates also in our own dialogues, economic dialogues with the Chinese on market entry and market access. This is not going to happen. This is wishful thinking, because the Chinese are not liable to give up any control of the market and create access for international business within their market beyond a certain degree. So we are looking at, and globally, of course, what we are seeing is that international MNCs will increasingly, or international business will increasingly face competition from government-funded Chinese enterprises. The issue on this is wide open today, but the more interesting part is that these SOEs have a strategic purpose, funded wholly by the state, or at least largely by the state. And despite the challenges they will face, they can withstand short-term costs. So the Chinese SOEs, despite their weaknesses, despite the challenges, are there to stay now in the global economy, as China sort of as the weight of the global economy moves increasingly towards China. So I think these are issues that come up again and again in the conversations we have about the Chinese economy, about the Chinese state. And I think it bears reminding ourselves that the more current phrase dual circulation that the Chinese now use in terms of the further reforms post the 13th five-year plan is actually a phrase right out of the Marxist lexicon. So let's, I think, keep in mind broadly that the Chinese state is an ideological state. It has an ideological purpose. It has an ideological trajectory. And the SOEs in the public economy, as Arvind has stated, actually fits in with the strategies and the impulses of the state. So in a sense, I think any discussion on this book today, the discussion we're going to have, I think will raise a lot of questions about the nature of the Chinese state and how we perceive that and how we deal with this particular kind of Chinese state in the years to come. But I won't go on this because we have a very distinguished panel here. And I just want to very briefly introduce the panel, and then we will start the discussion. Arvind, of course, you know, the author of the book, is a senior research fellow at the HSBC Business School in Beijing, Peking University in Beijing. And, you know, he holds a PhD in Chinese studies from JNU, Arvind, right? Or from China? Yeah, okay. And with a particular interest in political economy. And he has written an earlier book called Tailspin, The Politics of India-China Economic Relations. This was a book that emerged before the current book that we are going to be discussing. Shanti Pandit is an old friend, professor at Pune University, at Savitribai Phule University. And very interestingly, I'm really interested in what I saw in the publication, Shanti. You have a book on Parliament and Foreign Policy in India, which was published in 1990, but more recent publications on the retreat of the state, implications of drug trafficking in India. I would love to see that book when it does come out, right? Ambassador Bhagwati is currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. And what interests me most, I think, about Ambassador Bhagwati is not so much his ambassadorships, but his book, The Promise of India, How Prime Minister Nehru to Modi Shaped the Nation. This is more recent book, right? And Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, again, honorary fellow at the Institute for Chinese Studies, but also a senior fellow at the CPR, one of our most well-regarded institutes. And most recently, the chair of the Working Group on Migration, Government of India, and member of the High-Level Railways Restructuring Committee. So with these very, very brief introductions, and I would encourage all our participants to please look at the longer introductions, which are equally fascinating. I would like to ask, first of all, Professor Pandit to say a few words about the book.
Thank you, Professor Balla and fellow panelists and Arvind Yellari. Let me first congratulate you on this very interesting book, Between State Capitalism and Economic Statecraft. The first issue that brought me while I was reading the book, a lot of work you have done, a lot of data, excellent Chinese sources that you have brought in. And it is very useful for especially Indian scholars to have such good, ability to understand the Chinese from their own sources and their own point of view. While saying that, my first idea when it came in, because you have said in one of your things that the state-owned enterprises are the core institutions of the Chinese economy infrastructure. This makes see, when we teach international political economy, we usually put the market versus the state. And you have the famous book by Susan Strange, who said that retreat of the state because the market was increasing. So if you've seen in the typical liberal, neoliberal order, the multinational corporation or the transnational corporations are seen as non-state actors. And here we have a new, entirely a new challenge, that is where the state overlaps with the multinational corporation. So the state is the multinational corporation, and so the multinational corporation is controlled by the state. What it brings in a huge problem for international political economy, because we will have to now study the Chinese state, which is also a multinational corporation. So how do you separate strategic policy from what would we say economic policy? So is the old saying coming back that the flag follows the trade? Because this has been one of the major issues in Africa, wherever the Chinese have made their investments, including South Asia. Let me also congratulate you because you have brought in that the idea that we have from the outside is that usually a communist party is a monolith, but you have brought in the huge complexities, the issues within the party which has struggled with this change of state capitalism, and you call it red capitalism. So I like the word from the red peril. Maybe we will have to study the red capitalism. And I think your book is a very important contribution to this new type of variable we have in international political economy that is coming in. The other issue I would like to here refer to is what Professor Balla had flagged off, and that's the issue of the nature of the Chinese state. Is there a change from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Xi today? I think given the way Xi has changed, the nature of the state is very important, because it's not like Deng Xiaoping. Nothing is done quietly now. There is a lot of the Chinese are more aggressive, you would like, let's say, assertive in their diplomacy today, what is called the wolf warrior diplomacy. So do you think this helps state capitalism? Because usually business are neutral when it comes to political interests. But here you have the state, literally, as rightly said by Professor Balla, it is an ideological state. But ideological state, which initially we thought was contradictions, but now they're strange bedfellows, they coexist very well. That is liberal, order, or new, whatever Adam Smith revisited, as you have said in one of your chapters.
Yes, come in.
Wealth of nations, and as well as with a centralized communist party where, what to say, it's not democratic by any, what to say, is the way we think of democracy. The other thing that I would like your epilogue that you have brought in is good, because it does talk about the post-COVID order. The post-COVID order, and China has got exposed to a very large extent because of their own dealing with the COVID crisis. I think there has been a failure of, till now, what we have seen, a very successful diplomacy, where the quiet type of diplomacy which has disappeared. And also, how would you see the Chinese state-owned enterprises working with innovation? I think they're doing very well there as well. Most of us know that China is competing with the United States in the next technology, that is artificial intelligence. There are only two superpowers in artificial intelligence, that is the United States of America and China. And China is very aggressively pursuing this idea of innovation. So here in your book, what I found very interesting is you have an ideological state that is able to perfect a public sector, a state-owned enterprises, to move towards innovations and at the same time be in the fortune companies. Very interesting, because this is a path that has not been taken by any other country. And this brings in a totally entire new paradigm shift in international relations as well as international political economy. Thank you, Professor Balla.
Sorry, I think we were supposed to have Arvind talk about his book briefly, right? And I just skipped that. But Arvind, you can come in at the end and correct all of us. Is that okay?
That's perfectly well, ma'am.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. Oh, this is terrible. I'm very bad at the protocols on this one. Okay. So can we have Ambassador Bhagwati then, please? Thank you.
Okay. First, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Well, Professor Bhalla, Dr. Arvind Yelleri, the other panelists, a very good afternoon to you and to everybody else who's listening in. I noticed two names of former colleagues in the Ministry of External Affairs. I see Ambassador Ashok Kant and Ambassador Vijay Nambiar. I also see Poonam Suri, the wife of Nalin Suri, who's a China expert in her own right. So I'm delighted everybody is here. What I've done is I've quickly jotted down a few bullet points. I find that it's easier for me to use bullet points. Then it's a little more structured than talking, at least for me. Others may have the ability to talk in a structured way without notes. I need notes. So here we are. I think there are no examples of such rapid and consistent success as Chinese SOEs in a socialist country, communist country, call it what you will. So to that extent, it's a bit difficult to compare. And I'll come back in a moment as to why I want Dr. Yelleri to compare the Chinese SOEs with the SOEs or whatever they were called in the then Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But as was mentioned by Professor Balla at the beginning, and also by the first panelist, that much has changed in the last few years. And the US is a little more insistent in raising issues about industrial subsidies. And obviously they're targeting SOEs among others, and the propping up of select sectors. But at the same time, taking a step back, one has to understand that China has achieved all this, not just in terms of the SOEs, but in terms of its overall GDP, which is now larger than that of the United States in purchasing power parity terms, not in convertible US dollar terms. But in terms of the per capita income, Again, on purchasing power parity terms, China is at about 17,600, while the US is almost $64,000 per annum, which means it's about 4 times higher. And we know that from here onwards, if you call China a middle-income country, I will call it just a little below middle-income country. It's still a long way to go to reach a G7 kind of per capita incomes. I'm setting the SOEs in the overall context of per capita income, but per capita income, as those in the audience who obviously feel that the per capita income doesn't give you a sense of welfare for people at the bottom of the ladder, I would agree completely, but purely for purposes of comparison. Now, I think the political economy issues were touched upon briefly. I know very little about political economy issues in China. I don't speak the language like many, I think, here, including Dr. Yellery, who speak Chinese and know the language very well. But from whatever little I've seen, it appears, and please pardon my pronunciation of Chinese names, so I'm sure it's pronounced differently, but in English it's written Xi Jinping. One Doordarshan announcer called him 11 Jinping and then lost his job very soon thereafter. He has modeling himself on Mao, or some kind of a souped up Mao, even more powerful than Mao in some ways. Those who follow the party hierarchy in China know better about this. But yeah, so coming back to what I briefly alluded to in the beginning, it's not clear from the book. The book is wonderful. It gives you tremendous details of SOEs, so much so that, I started not getting a headache, but I was overwhelmed with those tables and those long lists naming each and every SOE. But what is not clear from the book is why have the usual checks and freedom, which is like freedom of media and so on, not affected the workings of SOEs? Because, you can say that there is this form of reporting back and this or that or whatever. But we all know that in a one-party system, which is very authoritarian, and we don't need the proof from the Western media. The Western media can be quite biased and they have their own axes to grind. But even sort of abstracting from that, wherever we have found authoritarianism rising in India, you usually find that that is accompanied by relatively poor economic performance. And I will not get into more details about what happened during Indira Gandhi's time, because then it immediately becomes political. So I don't understand, and it's not clear from the book why. And so this is something that Dr. Yellery can think of as a subsequent book, as to compare and contrast SOEs in Eastern Europe with that of China, and why China worked and why did they, in relative terms. Of course, as we all know, in India in the 30s and 40s, everybody was very impressed with the USSR. They were doubling their steel production in 5 years, I think. Every 5 years, they were doubling steel production. And in fact, Nehru went to the then Soviet Union as early as 1925. So they were held up as a great model at one point of time. And subsequently, of course, that didn't work out very well for them. Maybe, just maybe, and this is again something, I couldn't figure it out from the book, but as I said, sometimes my eyes were getting glazed over with the depth and the amount of detail. Is it that the central government kept the heights, look at some of the major SOEs, and there is particular attention given. And then within those major SOEs, they are supposed to look at regional SOEs from whom they either get inputs or where they sell into. I'm here abstracting from the external world in terms of trade. But since I am now talking about trade, if you look at China's trade, where the products that SOEs produce or services, the overwhelming proportion of their markets is the West, same old G7 countries. So if you start getting too much, if you get too aggressive in some ways with the West, I don't know how it's going to square up with the continued success of SOEs, because SOEs are producing way more than what China needs right now. I have a number there. I noted it down. I mean, it's amazing. Yes, China's steel production touched 1 billion tons in 2019. I'm talking about before COVID. And just for purposes of comparison, India is almost comparable in terms of population. We were at 110 million tons. So we are roughly 1/10 of China. And I'm reasonably sure that in today's COVID times, China cannot use all those, all that much of steel. So it has to look for external users. And of course, the SOEs are, and again, please correct me in my pronunciation, Bao Steel Group and Wuhan Iron and Steel are supposed to be the largest. And there is Hess Steel and Shagang Group. Dr. Yelleri, you had my head spinning, looking through the names and trying to figure out who was what. Cement production, 2.2 billion tons, billion metric tons in 2020 compared to India's 340 million tons. So we are talking about 7 times more in China. So where will they sell all this if they get into a some kind of how should I put it? You know, they also need those imports because they are cheaper and good quality. So it's not as if the West can easily, how should I say, draw a trade curtain around China. It's not that easy. But yet they can perhaps do it more easily than China because of that per capita difference. And they trade the most among themselves. If you look at the G7 countries, and I looked at it very closely when I was in Brussels, trade between the European Union and the US, it's amazing just how much is going on in terms of both merchandise trade and also in terms of foreign direct investment. Now we come to China's big technology companies. Quite a few of them are not really SOEs. I mean, when we talk about, you know, Jack Ma, and we know what happened about his, he was going to do an IPO in New York, and because of one little statement somewhere, and I'm sure Dr. Yelleri, all that must be, you know, you must know that backwards. I have only read about it in newspapers, and I don't even know whether the newspapers were accurate in what they covered. But it is clear that this other ride-hailing company called Didi, it did some kind of an IPO and on some US exchange and got into trouble. Now, all this doesn't work well. I think even countries which are not that favorably disposed towards the West, not everybody is kind of falling backwards, getting impressed. And we don't need to talk about Afghanistan and what happened very recently in terms of the way the pullout by US was handled. Even abstracting from that, in overall terms, even those who are not constantly looking at the West for inspiration, some of the recent steps of China leave me a little sort of scratching my head. Why are you trying to, if not kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, at least kick it in the stomach? So why are you doing this? So what is going on? So it will be very interesting to hear from those who are experts here. What is it that is driving Mr. Xi Jinping to be taking steps which are obviously not consistent with China raising its per capita income and spreading prosperity even more widely within its, now coming to something which I think is afflicting, and I think the West and particularly Western publications like The Economist and the Financial Times, they are looking, they are kind of, and Bloomberg, they're like hawks waiting to find something wrong with China to try and project it as doom and disaster is looming. But even abstracting from that kind of desire of some Western publications, it is fairly clear that many SOEs are struggling with debt. And here I'm trying to look for the name of, yes, this is the one, something called Evergrande, which has its headquarters in Shenzhen. It seems, and this is authentic. There were people demanding their overdue payments for their wealth management products, and some others who had paid Evergrande it's somewhat like Unitech. You're all familiar with Unitech, and Supreme Court wants those founders of Unitech to remain in jail in Delhi. They were being sent somewhere else and so on. So this must be a giant, I mean, Unitech to the power of 10. So Evergrande has stopped housing construction after having taken money from people. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we expect from companies in less developed countries. So I don't know where all that is going. So it would be interesting to see the finance part of SOEs in terms of how leveraged they are as far as their debt is concerned. And now here I'm quoting from a publication which I have more confidence in. So it says that the private non-financial sector owes the equivalent of about 220% of GDP. I'm not talking about the government. The government's debt is very manageable. Unlike the fiscal deficit of India and many other countries, China's fiscal deficit is very manageable. But it is, we don't quite know what is private and what is government supported in China. At least I don't know. Arvind, you would know better if you were able to give a better sense. I don't get that sense from the book, but maybe it's buried somewhere because, as I said, sometimes it was difficult for me to read every page and every word in each page. So it would be interesting to know just how much of that non-financial sector, which owes 222% of GDP as debt, how much of it is owed to state-run banks or state-owned banks or state-supported financial institutions. The same amount of debt, by the way, it is not very low in the US. In the US, it's 164. If you look at the comparable number, it's 164% of GDP. But the strength that the US has, for whatever it is worth, I don't know if any of you have gone to the website of the People's Bank of China. Incidentally, in the 90s, I went there repeatedly as the guest of the People's Bank of China because I used to be in the World Bank, and they would receive me at the level of the deputy governor. They were so serious. I was a junior functionary in the World Bank. So they are very, very serious people. They want to learn and they want to know. But why do I say, talk about the PBOC, People's Bank of China? You go to their website, there is a portion which is English. You do not get the level of and depth of detail that you will get at the website of the Federal Reserve or of the Bank of England, or for that matter, Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India is a fantastic website when you look at the range and depth of data about the Indian economy and its financial sector. So it'll be interesting to know from you, Dr. Yellery, as to just how much of this is actually something that the Chinese government should be worried about, particularly when it does things like, not agree to Biden requesting for a meeting. You must have seen this, and this is a press item. I don't know whether it's correct. In addition to the whatever they discussed it seems either before or after, either at the level of Biden or at the level of the US government, they suggested a meeting, and it seems Xi Jinping kind of rebuffed that suggestion. I don't know whether it's true, but there is definitely enough evidence to indicate that there is a certain amount of hubris building in. And normally, whether it is at the level of the individual or at the level of a country, hubris is usually followed by a fall. So, and I don't know, and in a lighter vein, I was looking at some what is it called? Netflix series called Secret Nights or something. In Australia, they have the Chinese ambassador being shot dead by the security chief of the Chinese embassy. Why do I point to the silly serial, which I immediately switched off because it was completely kind of beyond any realm of reality, is that the West in general is starting to build a narrative through these kinds of, I can't call it a movie, serials or whatever, because Netflix didn't exist when the Soviet Union was around, but to paint China in a particular color. And given the fact that I will not get into this thing about they've stolen technology. No, I think they have great physicists and chemists and other scientists. Not that they win too many Nobel Prizes, but I don't think there is any bias in that. But I think when you have the West already orchestrating movies and serials against China, they should watch out. And it should be something which you may like to comment upon, Dr. Yelleri, when you give us the benefit of your views. I've taken too much time. Thank you so much for your patience. I'll put myself on mute now.
Yeah, okay, I'm getting off mute. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhagwati. That was very interesting, especially the questions over the financial aspect of SOEs and private debt in China as well, and the obtuseness of the information that we get or have access to in terms of these issues. Could I please ask Professor Mukhopadhyay to come in now?
Thank you, Professor Bhalla. Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So, Arvind, congratulations. So, as I think was evident from Ambassador Bhagwati's remarks, this is a real source book. It is the kind of book that you turn to when you need the level of detailed information on, for example, as you said, which are the SOEs who are in the Fortune 500 structures. But beyond that, it explores a large number of facets of the SOE story. And perhaps more importantly, from your broader point of view, the relationships, and this also sort of goes to Ambassador Rana's recent urging to the rest of us at ICS to think much more deeply and carefully about the domestic China. It does go very much to both relationships between not only just the government and the enterprises, but also, as you so richly described, intergovernmental relations and the issues around provinces. So let me just quickly sort of try and put down a few thoughts as to where some of these issues could lead, and some of these have been explored in the book to some detail, and others I think are questions that the book raises, which one can sort of then develop further, whether yourself or other researchers have followed. So the first question, I think, as an economist, is how is it that the state-owned enterprise manages to survive, whereas it seems to fail almost everywhere else? And the core answer to that seems to be the ability of the Chinese state to actually impose a hard budget constraint. Now, why is a hard budget constraint difficult to impose? It's difficult to impose because the consequences of imposing that hard budget constraint are that people lose jobs because enterprises will have to shut down. What I think the Chinese state has demonstrated with a great deal of, shall we say, heft and very clear messaging is that in many instances, and this is what you recount in your book when you're talking about the Titan, in the 1998 episode when sort of let go of the a lot of enterprises, that they're willing to take a large hit on unemployment. They're okay with a large number of people becoming unemployed. And this was when they were even before they had joined the WTO. Now, with a lot more economic muscle and heft, the question is, and this goes again to this whole idea as to whether Xi Jinping is the new Mao. The structure, therefore, is the ability to push through something as drastic as that. I think is a sword that hangs very heavily on most SOEs, and therefore makes them believe that that hard budget constraint is credible. And I think that is one key part of the story. But the second key part of the story is something that I wish we had spent a little more time with, which is the fact that as you look through the list of large enterprises, you find that the commanding heights, in some sense, in our language, or the strong in their language, were essentially basic industries, energy, infrastructure, basic metals, construction, and the odd, and of course, finance, right? The question, of course, is now, in the world that is to come, are these still, in some sense, the key levers of influence over an economy? And here, and that's the sense with which I now see the, as Ambassador Bhagwati was saying, quite inexplicable kind of moves on firms such as Ant Financial, is the idea that in some senses, the realization that these are sectors that they now need to have much more oversight over. They were sort of sectors which essentially came up while nobody was looking, in some of the sort of India grows in the night kind of situation. And now that you have a situation where you realize how central these kinds of elements are to your economy, they require much more oversight. And the ownership may still not change, but the signal is now very different. And of course, the pace of growth in some sense would also perhaps be somewhat affected, or may not be affected for the next reason that I'm going to talk about, which is the critical difference of true private sector in China, the kind that you see in Guangdong and Jiangsu and Zhejiang and others, especially Jiangsu and Guangdong, is the where do you get your finance? And both of them, they have used both the nascent stock market as well as, in some sense, informal finance on the Wenzhou side to sort of get their money into the system, which is why I find the finance is cheap and hence China can export hypothesis to be somewhat shaky. Because the large finance story has essentially moved much more to the SOEs. Therefore, as the state moves forward, you have the large state-owned financial sector, which continues to be state-owned, as your primary instrument of guiding structures in place. So if the Ant is prevented from listing and therefore raising money by selling equity, they may be able to get debt now from the formal sector at much more favorable terms, as long as they are appropriately controlled in some sense. And I was just wondering whether how you think of that space in terms of shifting this whole body from, shall we say, the old industry of energy and construction and so on and so forth. The second and linked, since we're talking about Ant, whose birthplace is Hangzhou, is, I think, the very nice sort of nuance you bring about to the whole issue of provincial and the role of provinces and provincial government. And one of the reflections that I would like from you is, if you can talk a little bit about why you think that only certain provinces have been able to do this very successfully, apart from the 5 sort of city municipalities, or sorry, city provinces, provincial cities. Why do you think this kind of provincial engagement with SOEs, or at least, or maybe one is wrong, maybe it is the visibility of provinces like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong that is sort of driving some of this, but maybe not, right? So that's the second kind of issue that I would like to sort of get a sense of. The third is the issue of, again, on the WTO and what Professor Bhalla said right at the beginning about the question as to whether or not, and also I think what was raised in terms of the whole idea as to whether or not we're going to have this more mercantilist approach to this whole process. And there, as of now, a lot of the engagement is that customer-facing or consumer-facing enterprises are still largely outside large SOEs. And it's in that context what would be really interesting is to perhaps take one or two products and in the way that you sort of unpack iPhone, whether one could sort of build a supply chain in that space to try and understand the interlinkages between the private and the SOE as you look through that particular supply. When is the SOE selling to the private? When is the private buying from the SOE? And that intertwining of the SOE and the private within the Chinese supply chain is, I think, something that would be really nice to begin to start thinking about. The other very novel area in some sense is the role of PPP. And it's not very well discussed within the Chinese system of public-private partnerships. And what you, and indeed, as you can, even you describe in your book, their movement towards PPPs is much later after ours. If I begin to date the Indian PPP from the late 90s, and let's say the starting of the Prime Minister's Task Force of Infrastructure. But what you then go on to show is something even more striking, which is that the PPP is no longer a PPP, but is actually the private part has become increasingly central SOE who are taking on these contracts. So there is a corporate structure. The contracts are in some sense neutral to whether the ownership of the firm which is taking on the responsibility is public or private. And increasingly, you are seeing a lot of central SOEs getting into the space, especially since construction was a big part of the central SOE story. And I was wondering whether you see this as one way of the center sort of restricting the provincial space for financial independence, which is what your SOE, the PPP is essentially allowing you to do by using another sort of linkage, another tie between the center and the state to tie them together. That's the final issue that I would like to sort of is an interesting issue in terms of how it goes through, and or actually penultimate issue is the issue of the use of the SOEs abroad and the BRI that you bring out. And here, in some sense, the BRI is often seen or shown as a reaction, as there was overcapacity in the Chinese state, and hence BRI to try and, it's an old-fashioned vent for surplus kind of model. But there is also the reality, as you demonstrate relatively well, that there has been enormous investment in the SOE and in SOEs in the same, multiple SOEs in the same sector. Something that we in India would be very chary of. But not only have the Chinese been able to use this multiple firms investing in the same sector to build competition between themselves, it also provides them with many more options when they're now moving into this globalization phase of the BRI kind of structure. And therefore, I'm wondering how much of the BRI was actually reaction and how much of it was foresight. Now, I might be reading too much into the positive stuff into the Chinese story, but it's just a way of posing the question. The answer may still turn out to be negative, but that's why the structure is coming through. And I don't know whether you've seen this recently, Arvind, and if you haven't, we can take this offline. There has been some discussion in China recently about, especially around the 100 years of the Communist Party, as to what, in some sense, is going to be Chinese political philosophy going forward. To them, to one commentator who I know well is Yao Yang from your university, Veda. And he seems to sort of postulate that both capitalism and Marxism are in some sense imports, which the Chinese have used relatively well to get to where they are today. And from now on, it's time to think about sinicizing the Chinese Communist Party and return back to Confucian roots. And it's in that context that I was wondering how you see the role of the SOEs, in case you have looked at that debate. Because thus far, the way your book reads it, it's largely been the SOEs as an instrument, as a way to achieve a particular goal. But I was just wondering whether they actually could be, in some sense, more than that, given the nature of, shall we say, virtue, meritocracy. And in that context, what would be really interesting is for me to understand, if possible, the nature of the senior management story in SOEs. We know that from the counties and the provinces, especially from the provinces, there is a core which is the cadre of the particular province that remains, but at the upper levels, you do have people moving in and out from other provinces as they're rotated through that kind of structure. Is there something similar that you see in the SOEs? Have you looked at the issue of what is the nature of top management in the SOEs? Surely the sort of party secretaries of the SOEs may definitely rotate around. I'm just talking more about the technocrats too, but they actually move around different SOEs of similar structures. It's a much more central structure. Lastly, thank you so much for writing the book. It was a pleasure to read it, much to learn. And as you can see, it's provoked a number of questions, and I'm sure those who read the stuff will find that it raises many, many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukhopadhyay. So, Arvind, you have an enormous amount of questions already on your plate, right? But we are looking forward to hear you talking about your book. So please.
Thank you, ma'am. I think since we have the eminent panelists who have already commented on the book, I do not want this book launch or a kind of a propaganda kind of scheme of thing over here. I'll just quickly jot down, why this book is here. I know, is there a coincidence 2021, or is it really a coincidence that when China is emerging as a top country having sizable amount of companies in global Fortune 500 companies, is there any coincidence? There is no coincidence as such. The research was on for about a couple of years. And in past 1 year, especially, there were a number of things which came up and which shaped the idea behind the book. the basic concepts which shaped the book was all about we have enormous amount of literature, full of literature on Chinese economy, and we get to read all sorts of literature. So essentially, when the idea started shaping up, it was all about is anything new or which is left out, which is not done by the other researchers, or is there any scope where I can do something new? I started looking at the larger literature when I was a student, and I started having access to the books on Chinese economy. I was overwhelmed with the binaries which were developed to study Chinese economy. Well, will the Chinese economy survive, or will China collapse? Or that's the basic binary which has been developed. More than that, the Chinese economy, they're growing, at a generational speed, or maybe something, which is India should emulate, India should learn from. Or how the Chinese economy has been, performing exceptionally, and it's a learning lesson for the other emerging economies. And that has been, I think, some of the fundamental binaries which has shaped, influenced the Chinese, the literature which looks into Chinese economy. So I wanted to just get out of this oxymoron, and then being somebody who is researching on Chinese economy, I wanted to develop something which would go beyond these binaries. So my problem was not that the China has a state capitalism. So I did not want to problematize that. I wanted to go beyond that. Well, because we have the state capitalism everywhere. We have state capitalism in young democracies. We have state capitalism in in democratic countries, including Turkey, Thailand, Malaysia, and we have different types of state capitalism. So what is wrong state capitalism being in China? So that was not the problem area. But the question started emerging when one looks at, despite China's current economic downturn, the overall economic success of an authoritarian state, which is partly capitalist, partly communist, has been able to increase its appeal as a model, as an alternative to free market capitalism. So that was the basis. So going beyond that binary, I was stuck that the book should go and talk more than these binaries, the state capitalism. So I wanted to have a methodology. I wanted to have a tool. And the state-owned enterprises offered me the best opportunity to study them, because state-owned enterprises, the way they were reformed post-1978, the processes of structuralism, and then the rising centrality of SOEs in states' control over economy. These all indicate the style of party and the state to have a control over the economy, and then the larger picture of the state capitalism which China pictures. Then beyond that, it was important that just to sketch SOEs and their central role in the Chinese economy. We have seen in past few congresses how the Chinese state-owned enterprises have been pictured, core as in heart, or maybe another big brother in the industries, in the manufacturing. But what was left out in most of the literature, and this is not only the literature coming out of subcontinent, but also largely from the Western literature or the authors, that the competition between SOEs, whether those are manufacturing industrial SOEs, financial SOEs, the banks, the financial institutions, or the administrative agencies. So those competitions were not reflected in the book, on the literature. And if one takes a granular look at this competition between these verticals in SOEs, it gives a kind of an alarming view of the fragility of reforms, or the various micro detailing about how Chinese economy, putting those state capitalism in mind, forwarded, or it marched forward, it marched ahead. So that was an important part when we started working at the project on the books. As Professor Partha has correctly pointed out, then looking at the verticals and the competition between the SOEs, if that gives some kind of idea, how severe, how acute the need to rectify or process the state capitalism in China was emerging as an immediate need. At the same time, the subsidiaries, state-owned enterprises at the provinces, as I call it in the book, SSPs, were having or were developing a different kind of reactions to the central imposed state capitalism. In the book, I mean, there is not a single place, but it's scattered at a number of places where I give an impression and explained it, that the state capitalism did not exist as one uniform, larger superstructure, concept. The state capitalism did exist in provinces or within provinces, and their notion of controlling the economy, then developing the levers to control the economy, and how those eventually help the central authority, the state council, to develop or mesh out their larger concept of state capitalism. So it was essential to look at the provincial level of definitions or metabolism, which were contributing to the state capitalism. And I think that was a major challenge to deal with, or to understand, or to differentiate between, how these different, dynamics have come on the forefront and played an important role. While doing it, it was important that it was noticed that fine, SOEs are playing an important role. SOEs can be one of the tools to explain, the state capitalism or advancement of state capitalism, and then the subsidiaries of state-owned enterprises, their reactions to the central authorities. Because as you go away, because in Chinese, they say that as you're far away from the emperor, you feel more less burdened, and you feel more princely. So that exactly happened with the subsidiaries of state-owned enterprises. The way they were functioning in the provinces, they were growing stronger. They were not only growing stronger, but they were putting more pressure on the provinces. And then the provinces had to develop, I would call it, a symmetrical scenario building and negotiations to deal with the subsidiaries on the one hand, and to this state-owned enterprises, which were run by the SASA at the center. And the whole dynamism, the contest between the provinces versus center, as well as the central-owned SOEs and the provincial controlled SOEs or subsidiaries, were the important examples which gives an idea of the different cycles of state capitalism and economic statecraft, which were shorter in time span, and smaller in scale as well as, but it had its own deep impact on the state capitalism, the Chinese state capitalism, the way it emerged. So essentially, I think the research for the book was, more than the holistic understanding of state capitalism, but also look at these shorter cycles of state capitalism, which were introduced by the state, which were introduced by the non-state factors, and which were introduced or catapulted by the external factors. So if you put all these factors influencing the state's response to the economic behavior, you come out with interesting stories. And I think that's where the book wanted to bring those interesting facts in one place, and try to bring out the interesting contradictions which one can look at it. While doing it, again, the point which Partha was pointing out to, economic statecraft is something which was essentially helping the state capitalism to become stronger, to become more reactory, or to become more what would say more stable. That was initially, but the relation between the state capitalism and economic statecraft did not remain constant throughout past 40 years of reforms. It kept on changing. The role of economic statecraft sometimes helps state capitalism to change the course And at the same time, when the state capitalism understood that this is where it has to locate itself in next 10 to 20 years, the economic statecraft was shaped accordingly. So the interplay of this state capitalism and economic statecraft has been a major player or a dynamic which has influenced what we see in present China. Well, that was the shortest description I can put together for the book. But I think if ma'am allows, I don't know if I can take some of the questions which were put forth by the panelists and try to answer some of them. So to start with, Santashri ma'am, thank you so much for taking out time and reading the book and commenting on few areas where the book can maybe do better, or maybe when I revisit and do the next studies, it will help me. Your comment that flag follows the trade, I think in Chinese case, it was 2 cycles. It was the trade which followed the flag, and then later on the flag followed the trade. So that is, we can see in the Chinese case, it happened that way. Secondly, about your question about wolf warrior, so the Chinese, especially if you look at the Huawei's strategic meetings, Mr. Chang's statements about how the Chinese companies have to take on the whole rise of Huawei from 3G, 4G to 5G. It has been said that in 3G it was crawling back, in 4G it was walking step by step, close shoulder to shoulder with the Western companies, and 5G it has taken a leap, and in 6G it has already started. 2 years back, 6G, they are now patenting the 6G technologies. So in that case, the Chinese are becoming aggressive. I think it is just a kind of evolution, one can say, about the Chinese companies' outward orientations, because there has to be, lately the Chinese leaders understood that there has to be something, which has to be dealt with a lot of firmness, is the political pressure. And I think that's the reason why the Chinese state really do not mince words, when it comes to exerting economic pressures and political pressures. So I think it's a natural evolution as far as the China's state capitalism or economic statecraft is concerned. An answer with regard to your question about SOEs with innovation, overall, Chinese have been struggling to make space in the innovation sector, which the Chinese often neglected in the 80s and 90s. Somewhere in 2003 onwards, the Chinese understood that they have to have command over the critical technologies. And from then, the China started sending students to study these critical technologies, get them back, employ back in domestic companies, and help them to improve their knowledge and, get work on board. But having said that, the SOEs are still struggling in the domain of innovation. So a lot of the innovation has been done by the private agencies. And if the SOEs have any credit in innovation, that goes to the universities and the research labs it has established within the university system. But innovation is not something, a formula which you can induce, right? Innovation has a lot to come with the capacities, the orientation, the personal orientation to invent, to do something new. So, you have a different kind of innovation ecosystem in Taiwan, an ecosystem in China. So I think I would challenge the basic understanding which is outside that, Chinese SOEs are doing better in innovation. I would say that there is a lot there's still a lot to happen as far as SOEs control or reactions or control over innovative technologies are concerned. Now, few remarks by Ambassador Bhagwati, and I think those are really important and very pertinent comments. Yes, I think going ahead, it would be interesting to look at or make the comparison between the state-owned enterprises in the Soviet Russia and China. But in couple of my initial chapters, I did indicate, maybe I did not indicate it as strongly as I need to be. There is a lot that Chinese state and the Chinese state economy, including the state enterprises, learned from the Eastern European economies, Czechoslovakia, Poland. When the whole democratic, moment started taking place in Eastern Europe, and there were pressure coming on the Chinese leadership that they should do the equal thing, they should open up the economy. There was a big bang approach which was taken by the Eastern European economies, but the state-owned enterprises were not under that any pressure, because I think the Chinese were trying to create, or were in the rush to create the second source of the growth for the Chinese economy was opening up, introducing the privatizations. So this state special economic zones of privatization in agriculture, in TVs were the result of it. So yes, certainly at one point, state-owned enterprises avoided imitating and copying from the Soviet examples, but they could have done better than that. Your question about, I think I could not gather it properly, but maybe you were saying that the freedom of media, why it is not working in case of China. Well, I think is media is still part of, still controlled by the state. So the fallacies or the problems in SOEs were not brought out openly by media or by the critics, but it were the leadership which understood that if the state-owned enterprises have to survive, they have to compete. So as a result of it, in late 1990s, the efforts by Zhu Rongqi to end or to delist state-owned enterprises, the number was as high as 350,000. So that was with regard to that.
Dr.
I'm not
Yelleri,
sure.
Can I?
Yes, of course.
You've got the main part of the question, but the question basically is, wherever there is a government-owned entity which is reporting to some government officers or minister or whatever, there is a relationship where you don't want to admit to failure or to performance which is lower than what is expected or what has been projected. So that is when the media or some other independent entity, as in India or in the West, points this out. So, and then you have a court system, and whether our court system is faulty or could be better is another point of, people can have different points of view. But in China, since the courts, the central bank, the media, everything is controlled, it is quite incredible that they can have feedback loops by which the central leadership, because I'm sure there are rivalries. Suppose you are in charge of coal production and whatever else you are in charge of, and there is another minister who both of you are trying to become Politburo members. You want to hide any shortcoming in performance, which in some other country the media might highlight, but given your reporting relationships, nothing comes out into the open. So despite all that, there is so much success. So that was my question.
Yeah, you're correct, Ambassador Bhagwati. I think one point I would like to add over here is that mid-1990s, the central leadership understood that the provincial enterprises or the subsidiaries of the provinces and the provincial leaderships were growing very stronger. They were going powerful. So there was a need also from the central leadership to put control over the provincial, the leadership by reforming state enterprises very aggressively. On your question is that if China is focusing on only few sectors or few SOEs to reform or to bring changes, it is apparently seen that the Chinese enterprises which are into finances, which are into the heavy manufacturing, for example, shipbuilding, or they are into big machinery productions, those have been always given weightage or protection by the state council. So it is evident that in the process of reforms, Not all SOEs were given, preferential treatment, but the few categories of SOEs were given, preferences over reforms. Now, your question about, not question, but observation about, the way Alipay or TT, they have been dealt with government, and it becomes problematic for the private enterprises to perform in China. So the private and government relationship. So essentially, if I can just try to map the relationship between private and public in China, starting from 1978, the private enterprises were given a lot of footage, a lot of leverage to perform. And this continued until the big reforms which were introduced in the 1990s, and the major state-owned enterprises were liquidated, or they were told to close the shop. Until then, it was fine. But I think after the Ransai policy, a talent policy which was introduced in the early 2001, 2002, to take on the foreign companies which were coming to China and competing with the domestic enterprises, then the state-owned enterprises got a new lease of life, and they started feeling they have to perform better than the private and better than the foreign enterprises. So I think that was the turning point. That turned out to be a turning point to define the role of private and public enterprises in the Chinese economy. Going forward, there are a few things which the Chinese, especially under the rule of President Xi Jinping, did not want. See, there are a few disruptions which the state introduced. The first disruption the state introduced and wanted, e-commerce to come, or maybe the private banks to come and play, because they wanted to make the public banks insecure. They wanted public banks to perform. And that's the reason, you got dozens of private banks coming into play, e-commerce, Alibaba. They are the product which the state introduced. And when the private enterprises started becoming more powerful or central, now there is a duopoly as far as the e-commerce is concerned. Now, apart from the e-commerce, when Alibaba wanted to enter into the credit business, that was the major thing, because you would see that manufacturing, the Chinese state can still control, still can manipulate, but the golden point where the manufacturing connects with the economy and the state council intervenes is the financial institutions. So when Jack Ma started eyeing that financial sector, credit business, because I think most of the businesses want to get rid of the debts, they wanted to get the credits because they had this pressure to get the capital and perform. Then Jack Ma was trying to get into an area where Xi Jinping did not want the private businesses to come. And I think there was a red line which was defined by the state, by Xi Jinping. And I think that's the reason you would see what is happening with him. Now about your question about the debt, okay, and is Chinese state worried about it? Chinese state is certainly worried about it. And I think there was one point, where it was difficult to identify which is the sector, which are the entities which are, which own so much of debt. Once it was identified state-owned enterprises, the state started looking at it more seriously. There were two ways of looking at it, the state response. Initially, the state thought of not offering any respite to the big enterprises. And you have the example of Yongchun Coal, and you have the example of Tsinghua Unigroup, where the government refused to bail them out. And that was one alarming, situation where everyone was taken aback and thought that, okay, this is something new. The government is not ready to bail out the state enterprises. That means that we should stop. And that means that was a lesson for the state enterprises not to default, okay, and not be very careful about it. Now, the second attempt, now, once the state council or the central government started taking that seriously and stopped state-owned enterprises or stop bailing out the state-owned enterprises, it was an alarming situation. Something has to happen. So you would see that essentially provinces like Guangxi, provinces like Henan or Hubei, they came up with their own funds. where they're helping their provincial enterprises or the subsidiaries, who are actually the subsidiaries of the state central enterprises, to bail them out. So there are two ways which indicates that the debt has been taken seriously, but the approaches to deal with this debt are different, not same. Please forgive me if I haven't answered your question. We can take this up again. Now, coming up to a few points which Partha has pointed out. Again, let me know if I miss a few of your points. The first point is that if I'm missing the first point, I think this is the second point which Partha was mentioning about, that have I mentioned only the certain provinces or these SSP, the subsidiaries as state enterprises or the provincial enterprises. This is in case with all the provinces, tier 1 provinces, tier 2 provinces, and tier 3 provinces as well, where the provincial enterprises are struggling to maintain their market share and compete with the centrally owned enterprises. But only I think I have mentioned Jiangsu, Zhejiang. I think I could only cover that, but this is the case with other provinces as well. A point about PPP. Yes, I think central authorities are not using only using PPP to control provinces. That is not the entire reason behind it. But PPP has been used to force the private enterprises to be partner of public endeavors. Because lately you would see that from 2012 and 13 onwards, the private enterprises have stopped bidding for PPPs. They are not complying, or maybe they do not fulfill the criteria. But then the case of PPE has turned out to be something which the state is forcing upon the private enterprises. The PPP is nothing against the provinces, and until I finished my study and research for this project. Yes, with regard to BRI was not a reaction. BRI was a well thought, a very composite brain programming which the Chinese and Xi Jinping developed it. 2013 is not certainly from where the BRI originated. It originated a lot before, when Xi Jinping was in Zhejiang, and then was promoted to be vice president, and nominated to be the general secretary, and so on and so forth. So BRI is not a reaction. Rather, what I would say that BRI was planned in such a way, and if you can go beyond the investments, or if you can go beyond the trade, there are certain areas where BRIs look into strategy areas. BRI looks into trying to become a dominant currency in their trading partners. BRI attempts to make a long-term, symmetrical relationship between the trade interest between China and the trading partner. So BRI was not a reaction, and I think within BRI, if you try to see and map out the role of state enterprises, it has been very central, especially not manufacturing, but the financial institutions, the banks, China Construction Bank, Exim Bank, and so on and so forth. So that is it. And I think the last part of your observation about what is going to be China's philosophy, is there more cynicizing happening, technocrats? The present leadership at the SOEs, which have returned and which have taken over, even if you look at the structure of TT, if you look at structure of the Tencent or Alibaba, you would see that those who are at the top management, their age group is somewhere between 38 to 47. That is the age group they are, the young technocrats at the helm of power and control. They have returned from foreign universities, taking their completing their internships. And certainly in the present context where Xi Jinping wants more state intervention and control over the economy, the insignification has already started, already had begun. It has begun from past 5 to 6 years. I think as a result, you would see that the state-owned enterprises are trying to become more concentrated or focused about the Chinese interest, how they can, change it. It is no more about pleasing the central authority, but I think somewhere there is a growing realization within the top brass of SOEs that they have to perform, not for the party and state sake, but they have to perform because I think there is a need for them to rise up and for their enterprises to outcompete their other enterprises, and indicate that they have risen up. So let me know if I haven't answered few of your questions, or maybe other questions which we have in the comment box.
Thank you, Arvind. That was very extensive, and I think you more or less covered everybody's queries here. I have a few more, but I think before I ask you anything else, there are a couple of queries on the chat box. Perhaps we can just go to them quickly.
Yes.
I think there's one by Chandra Vikash, which says, isn't state capitalism an economic power and anachronism at a time of deep health and ecological crises and the buzz on eco-anarchies and soft power? Broad, very broad, but if you want to answer that, yes, but we can go to the second one then.
No. I think quickly I want to answer that. Actually, in the case of the health and ecological crises, the state capitalism has taken the front seat. There is a more stress and more gravity the state capitalism has inherited out of this ecological crisis and health crises. So I would say that it is not anachronism, but I think it has somewhere underlined the role or the centrality of state capitalism to run the economy and to control the various crises with the ecological crisis or the health crisis which have come forward.
Okay, so we have one by Santosh Pai, and we can take the latter part of his comment as a question. Will it be interesting to see how SOEs reinvent themselves in the post-COVID era after the tech clampdown and US-China financial decoupling? Maybe some aspects of the Iron Bowl will reemerge as a common prosperity bowl.
Yes, I would see that, because I think SOEs were performing, as an independent entity and their correlations with the state agenda or state propaganda. But after the crisis, after the pandemic, the state-owned enterprises have realized that they do have a lot of responsibility and accountability to manage, the critical situations where they have to cater the welfare factor of state's role, or maybe the state social welfare schemes. So yes, the state-owned enterprises will come into the center stage and will try to play a constructive role to deal with this crisis. I think, yes, I agree with you.
Okay, there's a question on your YouTube channel, but it's from Mr. Samarjit Singh. And it asks you to explain where Indian PSUs fail to match the efficiency and growth in comparison to Chinese enterprises, and how do Chinese enterprises earn trust and goodwill despite coming from state backing?
Well, I think the one important thing which I've always been pointing out about here is if you look at the state-owned enterprises, the access to capital and access to market has been phenomenal compared to the Indian PSUs. Another thing about the PSUs, Indian PSUs, is the efficiencies. Efficiency is all not about sitting around the table and planning what is the priority, from where the capital is coming, what is the break-even period. But efficiency is all about conserving resources, conserving both the human resource, capital resource, and also in energies and all these things. The present problem with the PSUs, which we try to learn from or emulate from the Chinese PSUs, is about saving on these loss of these energies, how to efficiently manage the human resource, how to efficiently manage the energies or the energy loss, maybe the transmission loss. So I think these are the few things. I will not go into the macro details of this thing, but yes, these are the few areas where the Indian PSUs can take a lead or learn from from the Chinese PSUs. Apparently, there was a project proposal from the Indian Oil to know about or Coal India, how the coal is produced or managed or supplied efficiently in China than in India.
Okay, we have a comment from Dr. Hemant Adlakha, but that's really a comment on media. So you can read that online. But there's a question from Ambassador Nambiar. How relevant was the South Korean experience with chaebols for SOEs, as well as the new generations of business in China you are talking of? This connects with Professor Mukhopadhyay's question to move to a Confucian paradigm.
Well, I think I haven't got into the details of the South Korean experience with the chaebols for SOEs, but a few SOEs which in the earlier period of in the early 1990s, which went on to acquiring few South Korean firms. I'm talking about state enterprises, not about the private enterprises. The whole intention was to do the market auditing, to learn the best practices from the South Koreans and get back to China and then to implement it. I think in that context, there have been a lot of the Chinese philosophy going into it. When they want to go abroad, they want to learn from the market leaders, from the competitors. The Chinese SOEs have been doing different, or maybe approaching it in a different ways. I'm not sure if Ambassador have answered you enough correctly or no, but
okay, so that's your answer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple of very, very brief issues that I'm going to bring up. You don't have to reply to them right away because apparently we're running out of time. When I read your book, I thought that one of the most significant things that you sort of focused on throughout all of the chapters was this problem of equity sharing, right? Which is basically a question of ownership. Both in terms of the SEOs and in terms of the PPEs, the public-private partnerships, especially the public-private partnerships, and how that actually roils the picture somewhat. Because the whole issue of who shares what, who owns what, especially with state capitalism, becomes an issue that is already settled. So when private partners go into, have a partnership with public enterprises, clearly, there is no way in which private partners can push a line regarding ownership, or at least can draw a line regarding ownership. So this would make most private partners very, very reluctant anywhere in the world to really partner with a state entity. How is the state going to resolve this, right? That's number one. Secondly, I think you sort of posited some kind of a solution already that is in the making, which is that the large SOEs are not looking for private partners, but it's actually provincial SOEs and the smaller subsidiaries that are actually looking for partnerships, right? And the interesting part here, I thought in your book, in your discussion, was how the state is transferring its debt from the public to the private at the local and provincial levels, and whether in fact this calls for a healthy economy and healthy economic growth in the long run. In the short run, it may relieve provincial and local enterprises of their debt and their worry about financing themselves. But in the long run, how do private partners see this working out, right? And thirdly, I thought what was very interesting was also your discussion about why local and provincial enterprises are looking at private partnership because of the issues and the pressure of governance on them. Essentially, public enterprises are also welfare creating enterprise, right? They do deliver welfare. And at the local and provincial level, that's very important, especially with the retreat of the state from welfare. And the insistence that provincial and private governments set their own parameters on governance and deliver governance and fund their own governance to a large extent. So I'm just sort of wondering whether this central question of ownership and this question of passing on the debt to private partners, what are the implications of this in the long run? For state capitalism, and broadly using your term, state capitalism, and also for governance and the structure of institutions, healthy institutions, long-term healthy institutions at the provincial and local level. I mean, how much of this is taking on too much risk for the Chinese state to bear? That's the question.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Quickly, I would like to answer a couple of the questions. Well, it is certainly not healthy to lease out the enterprises at the provincial level. It's definitely not good in the longer term as far as the health of the economy is concerned. But the Chinese, the state is in a position where it wants to get or assure the provincial enterprises that they have to perform, and there is only possibility to do that is we are offering this bailout, and you have to be part of that. Well, that is not again a constructive way of looking at it from the Chinese state point of view, because there are few enterprises which are provincially owned, and the provinces have wherewithal to support them. But it is just the party's interest, because if you look at the trend, not all the provincial enterprises have been benefited by the scheme. We see this thing happening in the Yangtze River economic river basin, but this is not happening somewhere else. So this is not consistent economic tool or method the Chinese state is deploying. There are a lot of inconsistencies with regard to that. About the reluctance or equity sharing, private enterprises have been always very when it comes to the equity sharing, and private enterprises really do not want to give up the opportunities the state offers to them, because the private enterprises are not truly private. They're having access to state capital there, and the state provides them opportunities and market access as well. So the equity has been seen something a give and take, or a compromise the private players are doing or are engaging with the state, Chinese state, I think, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arvind. That was a very interesting book to read, I must say.
Thank you, ma'am.
It filled a lot of the gaps I had about actually how PPEs function on the ground, as well as how SOEs are doing, the health of SOEs in China today, and of course the future of the objectives of the state. So when you married state capitalism to economic statecraft, it gave us a very clear picture of what kind of decisions the Chinese state is likely to take on its economy in the coming future. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants and all the panelists. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Bhagwati.
Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Okay, goodbye. All the best.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Bhalla, and thank you, Arvind and Germany and Professor Pandit for a